Hi there. Welcome to Bible Slash Chat. Gus, hello.
John, how are you doing?
I'm fantastic. It's good to see you.
It's really good to see you.
I feel like I'm introing a news, like an evening news thing, like 60
Yeah.
minutes.
Yeah.
Gus, hello.
Hello, I hope you're doing well.
We come to you tonight with some, I'm just kidding. Go
It's
ahead.
with that disturbing news.
Some disturbing news.
Yeah. Speaking of disturbing news,
Yeah.
one of my
Perfect.
biggest pet peeves, and I think yours too, but I don't know why I get so worked up over this,
Yeah.
is how people take Bible verses out of context.
Yeah.
Or there's a misunderstanding in their hermeneutic, right?
Mm-hmm.
And there's verses that we know, and we've done a couple of these
Yeah.
before, but one of them is a series that you've been doing.
Yeah.
Not that you've done it.
Right.
No.
Thank you. one of the
we
worst
come-
misinterpretations I've ever heard.
We come
came
to you
from
with disturbing news. You've disqualified yourself.
Yeah, exactly.
No, that's not. But it's a passage you preached on this last weekend, and it's a passage that I think everyone, whether you're single or married, you've read before, which is 1 Corinthians chapter 7, and it says this, verse 8 and 9 says, "But I say to the unmarried and to the widow that it is good for them if they remain even as I," meaning single.
Correct.
Then verse 9 says, "But if they do not have self-control, let them marry, for it is better to marry than to burn with passion."
Yeah.
So usually what I've heard is, well, you don't have the gift of singleness
Right.
if you struggle, with purity.
Yeah.
Meaning, so the best way to combat that is to marry.
Yeah.
So, the best way to combat that self-control or lack of self-control,
Lack of self-control.
it is actually to marry. But you mentioned that is wrong.
Yeah.
Right? So whatever made you think of that?
Well, so a couple things. First off,
Yeah.
one commentator I think rightly says this. I said this in the sermon, but he said, if this is what Paul means, that explanation, like someone who just is really struggling with sexual impurity, then just get them married because that's the best cure for that. If that's what Paul means, they said that's the most embarrassing verse in all of Paul's letters. Not because of the content of the verse, but because it's so contradictory to everything else he's written. So it would just be like essentially him like throwing caution to the wind and saying something totally different than anything else he says. So for starters, it's just not Pauline to say that. He wouldn't advise two people who are struggling with self-control and are struggling with essentially lust to then marry, thinking that would somehow fix that problem. It doesn't fix the problem. And in fact, just the opposite, it will actually increase that problem. So just at a very blanket level, just not good exegesis. It doesn't fit with the rest of the Pauline corpus. So then what do you do with that verse? Well, what he's actually doing here is interesting. The best way to understand this verse is to go back to what was happening in Corinth during this time. How do we do that? How do we rewind the tape in terms of time? Well, Paul actually does that for us, and he uses almost the exact same language that he does in verse 7. Look at verse 7. He says, "Yet I wish that all men were even as I myself am. However, each man has his own gift from God, one in this manner, another in that." So he's talking about, essentially, he's single. He's saying, I wish that everyone was single, but everyone has their own gifts. Some people are given marriage, and some people are given singleness. So everything is a gift that comes to us from God. That's what he's saying here. So if we rewind the tape here in terms of time, what was going on in Corinth at that time? Well, Paul uses the exact same language in verse 26. Look over in verse 26. He says, "I think then that this is good in view of the present distress, that it is good for a man to remain as he is." Now that's super important. Why? Well, because he uses language that he uses in verses 7 and 8. It is good. He says, "I think," in other words, like I wish, or this is my desire. And then he says, in view of the present distress. Well, what's going on? Well, we don't exactly know in terms of history, but there was a large famine during the summer of AD 51. Very difficult to get food, and so it was a major challenge for the Christians for sure. And then you also have the situation here in the potential situation in verse 26, where maybe there was some persecution happening to the church.
Yeah.
So the present distress that's occurring here is either some kind of famine or maybe the persecution. So what's Paul saying? He's not saying don't get married. That would not make any sense. In fact, when he says in verse 8, he says, "But I say to the unmarried and to the widows that it is good for them if they remain even as I," that is unmarried. Yeah. He says it's good to stay alone. Well, in Genesis 2, God says it's not good for man to be
Yeah.
alone. So who's right,
See,
Paul
which
or
is it?
God, right?
Yeah.
Well, then the good there is, it must be defined in the context of this present distress, this suffering that's come in the church. With that being said, then, that tells us that Paul wants them to stay single for their own protection during this season. So how does that relate to verse 9? Well, in verse 9 it says if they do not have self-control. He doesn't mean if they're just like losing it with lustful passion. He's saying there's two people who are in love, and they know it's going to be harder for them to be married than to be apart. But they still love each other. They want to get married, and they're so much desiring to be married and to be with one another. They're having self-control. They're being pure, but they really want to be with one another. And so they say, "Listen, we understand it's going to be more difficult, but at the end of the day, we love each other. We want to be together." Paul actually says this. He says, "Let them marry." And it's actually a command. Marry them.
Yeah.
And then he says it's better to marry than to burn. Well, what's the burning there? It's not talking about just like constant sexual temptation.
Yeah, of course.
It's talking about this longing for one
Yeah.
another. They're there.
This desire.
Yeah, this longing for one another, this passion for one another. It's interesting because that word burn, it can mean like burn in hell or burn with fire, but it also does mean a longing, a romantic desire for another person. That's one of the ways that it's used in Greco-Roman literature. So again, Paul is really just expressing the fact that there's two people who are in love, they're walking in purity, they're walking in the Spirit, they want to get married, even in light of the present distress. They know the complexity it's going to bring to them. They say, we're willing to take that chance. We love each other, we want to be together. Paul says, marry them. It's good. Get them married. That's fine. So what's the sum argument here? Paul wants them to be pure, right? He wants single people to be pure. He wants this couple who's longing to be married to be pure, and he wants married people to be pure. All of that is controlled by the Spirit of God. That's what he's communicating to them. And so his instruction to them is get married if you really want to get married, if you love one another. If you're single, understand that that's a gift from God and walk in purity.
That's interesting. I think that there's such a misunderstanding on that passage, and a cross-reference to that passage is 1 Timothy 5, right?
Yeah.
14.
5:14, yeah.
Where he's talking about younger widows.
Yeah.
And here again, he doesn't tell them, he's not talking about sexual desire here, but he says, therefore I want younger widows to get married, bear children, keep house, and give the enemy no occasion for reproach.
Totally.
So meaning all of the opposite of all of those things is giving the enemy for reproach.
Exactly.
And there's no sex to be mentioned.
Nothing
right?
there. Yeah, it's so interesting.
Yeah.
I mean, that's almost exactly the opposite language of 1 Corinthians in 1 Corinthians 7. Because in 1 Corinthians 7 it says, widows, I want them to stay single.
Yeah.
So here he says 1 Timothy 5, in a totally different context, different city, not the same distress. He says, hey, widows get married.
Yeah.
So his intention isn't for there to be like this two-tier system of Christianity where the celibate, like monastic people are the most righteous.
A sacrament, right?
Yeah, literally.
Of celibacy.
Yeah, that's the perversion of the Roman Catholic Church. So again, totally misunderstood verse, often used by young people, even in my hearing, to justify getting married in ways that they should not be. But all of that, sadly. But again, the conclusion that we should draw from this is exegesis is important.
Yes,
right?
yes.
Just a plain reading of that verse, you might say, what I think Paul's saying is, if I really have a hard time with this, I should go find a girl or go find a boy. That's not what he's saying.
Yeah.
His argument here is much more complex and nuanced than that. And you just have to be careful when you're reading. We need to read slow enough and say, well, this doesn't really fit with other things that Paul says. So what does he mean here? And as we read slowly, we start to understand what he's coming to.
Yeah, that's super helpful. And before we go, I do want to make a huge... I think a big plug is to reading slowly the scriptures. Yeah, there's a time for reading fast and skimming.
Yeah.
Doing your 10 chapters a day if you want to do those.
Sure.
But there's also the time when you're studying something to do it with thoughtfulness.
Yeah.
Reading, like you said, plain reading helps you. You don't need to go learn Greek. That's good if you can.
Yeah.
But I think that the plain reading and slowly reading of Scripture really does help you, even with that passage, right?
Yeah.
It really does help you.
It really does. And ask questions of the text, right? When you're reading and you hit something, you're like, wait a minute, that doesn't sound right. Ask questions. Like with this verse, it doesn't sound right. If you don't have self-control,
Why
get
would
married.
Paul say? Why would Paul say
And
that,
the verse
right?
before that, he's like, if you're a widow, don't get married.
Yeah.
But that contradicts something else I know. And start asking yourself those questions, and that will build a study into your a study habit into your thinking that will help you.
But it's important also of the historical context, the importance of of the immediate context, because you went to verse 26.
Yeah.
So there's an immediate context, but also the context of the book, right?
Yeah, totally. What's
why
happening?
Why is Paul writing this?
Totally. And again, this comes up a lot in 1 Corinthians, but a lot all over the New Testament.
Yeah.
We have to know our audience. It's so important. Before we really understand, we can really understand a book.
Well, you hit it out of the park.
Right. Well, anyway, yes.
You know what that means?
Yes, thank you.
You're not a big sports guy.
I'm not a big sports guy. Anyway, I hope that's helpful for you.
That means you did well. You did well,
I
John.
do follow European soccer. I can talk European soccer. Anyway, if you have any questions on this or any
when
other
you
topic,
hit it out of the park in European soccer, that's bad. I guess you don't follow it that closely. Anyway.
Yes. Thank you, Gus.
Good.
If you have any questions on this topic or any other topic, you can always email us at info@faithbibleoc.org. Thanks so much.
See ya.